Did Donald Trump's United States endorse Paul Biya's victory? Or was the US ambassador simply being polite because he lives and works in Yaoundé? To answer that question, one needs to understand how US foreign policy works in practice. You are welcome to the Beyond Africa podcast with me, your host, Ngalim Bernard. On the Beyond African podcast, we share African stories that change lives. Follow me to the end of this podcast as I share with you the undertones of American foreign policy and examples where the United States has disagreed with its ambassador in a foreign country when that ambassador made a statement regarding an election, but Washington either later clarified or reversed that statement. When the US ambassador in Yaoundé congratulated Paul Biya on his inauguration, but notably not on his re-election, many Cameroonians wondered, what exactly does this mean? I know, depending on your side, on your political side, you either celebrated because you were looking for a nod of recognition from a superpower that Paul Biya has won the election and has been recognized by Donald Trump, or you felt disillusioned that the United States government has recognized an election you disagreed with because you believe the United States should not recognize sham elections. There is a critical difference between what the US Embassy says locally and what the United States government, through the State Department and the White House, actually believes or intends to do or does when it comes to foreign policy. Just as way of context, in relation to these elections of October 12, 2025, I hosted Thibon Nange, the former U.S. Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs, on this platform. That is before the elections, and he explained the position of the embassy and Washington, D.C. In our conversation, I was very clear to him. I asked him why the United States issues statements that do not lead to any fruits. Listen to what he had to say.
Yeah, don't be expecting that. Because you know what happens at times like this is that the policy tends to be more driven by the US embassy in the country. And you know, to be honest about it, and having been ambassador myself, I know this, is that the US embassy does its best to maintain cordial relations with the host government, because you have to get the work done. So oftentimes the U.S. Embassy is a little bit warmer in its relations with the host country than what Washington normally might want.
When Washington's leadership, be it the Secretary of State or the President, is focused elsewhere, embassies may have more leeway to issue routine comments that do not necessarily signal a policy shift. In other words, the embassy's statement can be a message of convenience, but not a declaration of conviction, especially when there are no human resources to ensure that Washington, D.C. is on top of its game.
Well, remember, the Trump administration is still really just getting started. There are a lot of key positions which have not been filled yet, including the Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs. We had a very, very effective and professional person acting as the Assistant Secretary, Ambassador Troy Fitrell. He has now retired. His position was filled by another who I believe is a very high-level professional, Ambassador Jonathan Pratt. And but there's not a Senate confirmed assistant secretary. So a lot of other positions remain unfilled. Secretary Rubio himself is personally very much involved in a number of critically important issues for the United States of America. So a lot of what I would say is routine business for the State Department is just not going to be getting the kind of attention it needs until these other issues are settled. So I'm always a realist, and I always try to tell the truth. So right now, Cameroon issue is not getting, the kind of attention it would normally be getting into, 1 or 2 or 3 years of an administration. I'm very much hoping the positions will be filled. I mean, I was back there earlier this year on an acting capacity as Undersecretary of State for Management, and I left hoping that the position would be filled soon. There was a very competent, qualified person who has had Senate hearings, but the Senate has not yet voted to confirm. So that is going to remain, like I said, until all the positions get filled. A lot of these issues are just not going to be looked at closely.
Yeah, this is 8 months into President Trump's second mandate, and there is still a long time to go. As we speak, in Washington, D.C., the government is on shutdown, so the government is not functioning efficiently. I think this is about the 40th day of the shutdown. So the elections in Cameroon happened during that period. But that aside, how is the United States foreign policy structured? To understand this dynamic, it helps to recall how the United States foreign policy is built. At the top, there is a president. In the current instance, that is Donald Trump. He sets the broad direction of foreign policy. These include the values and strategic interests that the United States seeks to advance and to achieve around the world. Keep in mind, these are United States interests. They are not Cameroonian or foreign interests. Next to him, we have the Secretary of State. In the current instance, that is Marco Rubio, who executes the president's foreign policy, manages diplomacy, and issues official statements that represent the position of the United States. At the third level, we have the United States embassies led by the ambassadors. Currently, the U.S. ambassador to Cameroon is Christopher Lamora, and they serve as the operational arms of the United States foreign policy. They collect information, maintain bilateral relations, and communicate, but they do not make policy. They simply implement policy. Every public statement by an embassy or an ambassador is therefore very well calibrated, very well thought out to achieve some objectives. It seeks to maintain cooperation with local authorities, that is in the local country, on security, trade, and humanitarian matters. These statements seek to avoid provoking unnecessary hostility, and they also reflect diplomatic etiquette even during contested political situations. This, however, does not mean that the United States endorses everything happening in the host country. Often, the ambassador's task is to remain engaged with the host country, that is, work with the host country so that the normal embassy duties and operations continue, while Washington, that is, the Secretary of State in particular, deliberates and brainstorms on an official response to an issue of significance on which the United States needs to have an opinion. What is the difference between routine diplomacy and policy declaration? It is important to note here that diplomats are trained to choose words very carefully. So, when a U.S. ambassador congratulates a leader on the leader's inauguration, that phrasing is deliberate. It differs from congratulating someone on a re-election, which would imply that the United States recognizes the legitimacy of the electoral process. Note here that the United States statements regarding elections generally often mirror statements by the EU and Canada. In this instance, the United States has not issued a statement regarding the elections. It has simply issued a statement regarding the inauguration. The inauguration in itself is just a celebration and a formality without much ado with that process. So, the linguistic nuance is one of the quiet arts of diplomacy. It allows the United States to keep doors open, especially when an election is disputed, without taking a side publicly before the State Department finalizes its position. Not to say that the United States State Department would always have a contrary to that of the embassy, but just to clarify that the United States State Department could have a position that either confirms, clarifies, or rejects the embassy's position. That is why in situations like Cameroon's 2025 elections, the embassy's message may seem mild or ambiguous. It is intentionally restraining. It restrains the ambassador from making certain declarations because the final say is with Washington. But why do embassies sometimes sound softer? Ambassador Bernard once remarked that the embassy in any country lives in that country. So the ambassador lives and works there. His interpersonal relationship with the home government is very, very important. That simple statement alone reveals a lot. Embassies depend on cooperation with local governments to function, to do things like processing visas, run cultural programs, coordinate counterterrorism, and protect U.S. citizens. The United States is very intentional in protecting its citizens abroad. So if the embassy becomes too confrontational, access to ministries, permits, or even security could be restricted, and American citizens could be at stake. For that reason, therefore, embassy statements often sound warmer and more diplomatic than the tone used in Washington. As Ambassador Tibor again explained, the State Department might privately share concerns about governance or human rights, but the embassy must still maintain working channels. This balance often produces statements that sound cautious, are restrictive, and avoid any confrontation. Let me share a few examples where Washington disagreed or clarified the position of a domestic embassy. Venezuela. During Venezuela's contested elections, local U.S. officials, that is at the embassy in Venezuela, initially avoided directly confronting Nicolas Maduro by declaring him as illegitimate. The U.S. embassy simply acknowledged political tensions but urged dialogue. However, Washington later took a hard stance. In a 2025 statement, the State Department declared that Nicolas Maduro clearly lost the 2024 presidential election and has no right to claim the presidency. The difference between local diplomacy and national policy could not have been sharper. It was clear, it was hard and very focused. In Myanmar in 2021, when Myanmar's military seized power, some early embassy messaging described the event as a transfer of power. The backlash was swift. Within hours, the State Department in Washington formally declared it a coup d'etat, triggering the suspension of certain aid programs to Myanmar. Belarus, the 2020 election. After Belarus's 2020 presidential election, the local U.S. government issued a diplomatic message emphasizing the importance of dialogue and restraint. A few days later, however, the Secretary of State at the time, Mike Pompeo, denounced the election as neither free nor fair and refused to recognize Alexander Lukashenko's victory. What about next to home? In Kenya, in the 2007 election, the U.S. Embassy in Nairobi initially congratulated Mwai Kibaki on his re-election amid a chaotic vote count. After violence broke out and observers confirmed serious irregularities, Washington reversed course. The State Department stated that the U.S. does not accept the results as credible and called for a coalition government. These few examples show that embassies sometimes react in the moment when things are happening, while Washington is recalibrating and walking through the process. And once it gets enough information and after political consideration, Washington then makes a statement. So Washington makes statements based on information from different sources, not only from the U.S. Embassy. It also has other eyes and other cables that supply it with information. And one of those sources are advocacy groups from these countries that approach the State Department or senators, congresspeople to explain to them with data and evidence what they believe are the right results from the host country. Recently, Rubio, Secretary of State, took an important step that shapes how ambassadors need to communicate. In July 2025, Associated Press reported that the State Department had circulated a new internal guidance instructing embassies not to issue statements about foreign elections unless there was a clear and compelling U.S. interest. This was a response to inconsistencies in tone and timing, because some embassies had congratulated governments, but the U.S. government simultaneously criticized that government in private. That memo reflected Washington's determination to keep diplomatic messaging consistent, even if that meant less commentary from the field. But how to interpret these nuances? For citizens and journalists abroad, especially in politically tense contexts, these nuances matter. Read the wording carefully. You can contrast the embassy statement in Yaoundé to Paul Biya and the statement to Alassane Ouattara. Congratulations on your inauguration and congratulations on your election victory. These two are completely different. So, to understand the difference, it is time to watch for follow-up from Washington, if at all the State Department is ever going to issue another statement regarding these two elections. The State Department's press briefings or statements from the Secretary of State show the real policy. So it is time to observe what the United States has as policy towards Cameroon, if you are interested, or towards the Côte d'Ivoire, if you are interested. Observe U.S. actions and not just the words. See what might happen. Might there be suspension of aid, targeted sanctions, or increased engagement with civil society, because this would often speak louder than embassy tweets. So after all this, what does this mean for Cameroonians? Cameroonians should therefore view the ambassador's message for what it is. Diplomatic courtesy. Simple, full stop. Nothing more than that. It signals that the United States will continue engaging with the government of Cameroon on security cooperation, humanitarian relief, and development, but it does not validate the legitimacy of the election results. The real question is, what will Washington say next? If the State Department or the White House releases a statement focusing on human rights, governance, or the need for national dialogue, that is the true measure of U.S. position. It is important to note that Senator Jim Risch, who is the Senate Foreign Relations Committee chairman, has issued a statement in which he calls the election in Cameroon sham re-election. Take note that Marco Rubio, when he was a senator, was a member of the United States Senate Foreign Relations Committee. He was a co-sponsor of the U.S. Senate resolution on Cameroon and the Anglophone crisis, where they called for the continuous push for accountability and democratic reform. Now, as Secretary of State, his views will shape Washington's strategic posture than the local embassy's polite tone. So Rubio is not a visitor nor a stranger to the Cameroon question. He knows what the Cameroon democratic posture looks like. Senator Rubio and Senator Jim, who issued the statement recently about Cameroon and the sham elections, have an excellent relationship. At Secretary Rubio's confirmation hearing for his position as secretary, Senator Risch described their relationship by stating they go back a long way and have found themselves almost always in violent agreement on virtually every issue they dealt with, both on the Foreign Committee and the Intelligence Committee. Violent agreement on virtually every issue. Note this here. Senator Jim Risch and Secretary Rubio are colleagues in Senate, and they almost agreed on everything. Why is this an important perspective? It is easy to feel disappointed when a major democracy like the United States appears to congratulate a controversial leader or an election you feel was not free and fair. But diplomacy is a slow game. Statements of convenience are not signs of complicity. They are tools to maintain access preserve leverage, and buy time. The real influence of the United States often comes later, through sanctions, aid conditions, or behind-the-scenes negotiations. When Washington chooses to act, it does so based on its global priorities, not local emotions. This clarifies that the relationship between Senator Risch and Secretary Rubio could be a significant aspect of advocacy in the United States regarding the elections in Cameroon right now. Senator Risch is one who could pick up his mobile phone and call Secretary Rubio to talk about this issue. And Secretary Rich's statement did not come light. It was heavy, it was dense, and it captured all the elements that interest President Trump in foreign policy. National security, most important. Russia and China, critical. So, Senator Rich's statement was deep, important, but crafted in a way that would positively influence Secretary Rubio and President Trump as they make their decision, if at all they will make a decision regarding Cameroon. Consequently, anyone involved in advocacy in the US at this material moment should not feel disappointed by the statement issued in Yaoundé by Ambassador Christopher Lamora, because diplomacy plays at different levels. A knock on Senator Jim Rich's door could change everything. The decision lies on the desk of Secretary Rubio. In conclusion, don't confuse courtesy for policy. So the next time a US embassy issues a warm statement after an election, treat it as diplomacy, not as endorsement. The language may be polite, but the policy is set elsewhere. It is set in the corridors of the State Department and the Oval Office, not in the embassy's press room. Embassies may shake hands for convenience, but Washington decides who it ultimately stands with. Once Washington makes that decision, the embassy aligns. As Ambassador Thibault reminded us, embassies must maintain cordial relations to get work done, even when Washington is not impressed by the process. That is the difference between diplomacy and policy, between being present and taking a stand. Go to the comments section and tell us what you think about the current policy, what you have learned from this episode of the Beyond Africa podcast, and what you think should be done to enhance foreign policy, especially from the Cameroonian perspective. Word of caution: if you feel disillusioned by the elections and you think that change needs to come to Cameroon, this episode of the Beyond Africa podcast is not telling you that Washington will bring the change to Cameroon. The change to Cameroon can only be brought by Cameroonians. Washington can only defend its own interest and not the interest of Cameroonians. Cameroonians should defend their interest, should work around defending their interests. That is a point that most Cameroonians should be thinking about at this material moment. How do you defend your interest starting from Cameroon, and how do you defend your interest by influencing American foreign policy? Who are the right people to talk to in Washington, D.C. if you think that America can play a role in you achieving your aim in Cameroon? I have been your host, Ngalim Bernard. Here at the Beyond Africa podcast, we share African stories that change lives. What a time to be Cameroonian. Thank you all for liking, sharing, commenting, and subscribing. See you at our next episode.